He sat in the corner of the dimly lit room, the lantern's glow flickering against the mud walls. The air was thick with tension, heavy enough that even the children outside had stopped their games to listen. Inside, voices rose and fell like waves during a storm. She stood in the center, her voice sharp, trembling with anger and desperation. She pointed at him, weaving stories that dripped with venom, words meant to bury him under shame. And yet he remained still, watching, listening but never speaking. His silence wasn't weakness, it was a weapon sharper than any reply. Every accusation she hurled seemed rehearsed, polished, as though she had been waiting for this moment. She told the crowd how he had broken trust, how he had wronged her, how he had become cold and heartless. The villagers leaned in, drawn to the drama, whispering among themselves. But he simply sat there, his hands folded, his gaze steady, never once attempting to defend himself. The room was tense, filled with whispers and sidelong glances. Villagers crowded the doorway, their curiosity too strong to resist. At the center of it all, he sat with the same calm silence that had unsettled everyone before. His wife's words still hung in the air, accusations sharp as thorns, yet he did not rise to defend himself. To most, his quietness looked like surrender. But in one corner, behind a faded shawl, his mother sat with her eyes fixed on him. Those eyes, aged, wise, scarred by years of hardship. The night air was thick with unease. The villagers had gathered again, lanterns flickering, shadows stretching long across the courtyard. She stood in the middle, her voice raised, her hands slicing through the air with each accusation. At first, her words had carried strength, sharp, confident, dripping with the certainty of someone who believed the crowd would bend to her will. But tonight something was different. His silence lingered like a shadow behind every word she spoke. He sat on the wooden stool, shoulders square, eyes steady, lips unmoving. That silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It had grown into something heavier, something undeniable. And because of it, each sentence she hurled began to crumble under its own weight. She told them he had betrayed her, that he had lied, that he had stolen her trust. But her voice shook now, betraying her. The villagers shifted uncomfortably. They had heard these same words before, but they no longer carried the same bite. Against his silence, they sounded hollow, as though she were trying too hard to force them into truth. An elder leaned forward, stroking his beard. The courtyard was quieter than before. The crowd had grown weary of her endless words, though curiosity still pulled them to gather each evening. Tonight, her voice was softer but sharp, like a knife dragged across stone. She no longer shouted with the same conviction. Instead, she leaned into sorrow, into the performance of a broken woman. "He does not deny it," she said, her voice trembling just enough to stir sympathy. "Does that not tell you everything? He has betrayed me, yet he stands there like a stranger. His silence is proof enough." All eyes turned to him. He stood as he always had, straight, calm, unmoved. His face betrayed nothing, his lips pressed in a line that seemed carved from stone. He made no effort to protest, no attempt to unravel her stories. He only stood in that stillness, and though she thought it made him weak, it was beginning to make her look exposed. Because silence, when carried with dignity, does not accuse the innocent. It accuses the liar. And tonight, her guilt glimmered like oil on water, impossible to hide. The villagers noticed it in the way her hands shook, in the way her eyes darted whenever silence pressed too heavily upon her. They noticed it when she avoided his gaze, speaking instead to the crowd as though she needed their belief to survive. Each time she insisted he was guilty, her voice cracked with a hidden fear that they would see through her. His mother watched carefully, her wrinkled hands clenched together. She saw the shift happening in the crowd. She saw the whispers grow, not against her son but against his wife. "Why so many words if truth is on her side?" one woman muttered. "Why does she tremble if she is right?" The wife grew desperate, sensing the tide slipping away. She pointed at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look at him. He won't even defend himself. Isn't that betrayal? Doesn't silence mean guilt?" Her voice cracked into a sob that might once have earned her pity. But now it only deepened the unease. Because his silence was not empty. Was a mirror. And in that mirror, the villagers began to see her reflection for what it was. Not the reflection of a wronged woman but of a guilty one, trying to smother the truth beneath noise. The elder finally rose, his voice carrying calm authority. "If he has betrayed you, bring proof. Words are wind. Proof is stone." His eyes narrowed at her. "But if you have none, then his silence is heavier than all your claims." She faltered, stuttering, her words tripping over themselves. "Proof. That word again. It sliced through her like a blade. She clutched her shawl tighter, but no evidence came. Only more tears, more pleading, more noise that failed to pierce the silence that stood before her. He remained still. And in that stillness, her guilt became blinding. The villagers no longer looked at him for answers. They looked at her, searching for cracks, and finding them in abundance. The betrayal she had tried to pin upon him curled back toward her, slow and merciless. For though he refused to defend himself, his silence became a quiet betrayal of her lies. It left her alone, exposed, trembling under the weight of the truth she had tried to bury. And when the crowd began to disperse, they did not leave with anger toward him. They left with doubt toward her. Her voice had filled the night, but his stillness had carried the truth. And in the eyes of the village, her guilt now burned brighter than her words could ever conceal. By the sixth night, the story had already spread beyond the courtyard. The villagers whispered it in the fields, in the market, by the river where women washed clothes. Children repeated it in fragments, and the elders shook their heads with wary frowns. What puzzled everyone most was not her accusations. People had heard quarrels between husband and wife before, but his silence. "Why doesn't he say anything?" one man murmured to another as they carried water jars. "If he is innocent, wouldn't he defend himself?" But then the other man shook his head slowly. "Or maybe silence is his defense. Maybe he knows truth doesn't need shouting." The whispers grew, weaving through the village like smoke. At first, some believed her tears, her trembling voice, her desperate pointing finger. But the more she spoke and the longer he stayed quiet, the more the people began to see a different story. His silence was not emptiness, it was telling them something. At the market, a woman leaned close to her neighbor. "Do you remember the time when Rafik was accused of stealing grain? He shouted for hours, swearing he was innocent, but in the end he was guilty. This man says nothing, yet his silence feels heavier than all her words." By the river, another woman nodded. "It is as if his silence is shouting the truth. Can't you see it in his eyes? He is not afraid. He is only waiting." His mother heard these whispers too, and though her heart ached, it also swelled with quiet pride. The world was beginning to see what she had known all along. Her son's silence was not weakness. It was strength, a shield, a voice louder than noise. Meanwhile, his wife felt the weight of those whispers pressing down on her. Every time she passed a group of women, their chatter hushed. Every time she crossed the square, the men's eyes lingered too long, their expressions clouded with doubt. She knew the story was slipping from her hands. What she had built with words was being undone by the silence she could not control. One evening when the crowd gathered again, she tried a new tactic. Her voice was softer, her tears more convincing, her words less wild. "I am only a woman asking for justice," she said, her shoulders trembling. "Do you not see? His silence is the silence of a guilty man." But the villagers no longer heard her words the same way. They had been listening too closely to what was not said. His silence had shaped their thoughts. It had grown inside them, feeding doubt, creating space for truth to rise. An elder spoke, his voice calm. "Woman, your words are many. But sometimes silence carries the real story. And in his silence, we hear what is true." The crowd nodded, some quietly, others more boldly. She saw it then, the shift. The people were no longer hers to persuade. They had found the truth not in her cries but in his silence. And no matter how much she spoke, that silence echoed louder, stronger, unbroken. Later that night, as the village settled, the whispers continued. "He never said a word," one man told another, "but I believe him." "His silence," a woman murmured, "was worth more than all her tears." And so, the village whispered its judgment, not shouted, not declared in any formal gathering, but passed from lip to ear until it became undeniable. In his silence they had found the real story. And that story was enough. That night the crowd was smaller, but the silence around them was heavier than ever. He sat in his usual place, shoulders straight, lips pressed together, refusing to utter a single word. But though his mouth was sealed, his eyes betrayed him. Anyone who dared to look closely could see it, the weight he carried, the wounds he hid. His silence might have protected him, but his eyes spoke a language too raw to be silenced. The villagers, one by one, began to notice. A woman in the crowd whispered to her husband, "Do you see? His eyes, they're not the eyes of a guilty man. They're the eyes of someone who has been wronged." The husband nodded slowly, unsettled by the truth that shimmered in those dark, unblinking orbs. His wife, however, kept speaking louder than before. She filled the courtyard with more words, weaving lies with trembling hands. Yet every time her gaze accidentally locked with his, she faltered. because in his eyes she saw what she had tried so hard to bury. Betrayal. A quiet suffering that no lie could erase. His mother, seated close to him, felt the sting of tears behind her own eyes. She knew those wounds. She had seen them grow over time. The nights he sat outside under the stars, saying nothing, only staring. The mornings he rose before dawn, his face etched with an ache too deep for speech. She had hoped marriage would bring him peace, but instead it had only carved deeper scars into his heart. And now, in front of the whole village, his eyes told that story. A story of trust broken, of love twisted into poison, of a man who endured betrayal without retaliation. His silence held dignity, but his eyes revealed the cost of that dignity, the quiet torment that no words could heal. One elder cleared his throat, uneasy. "Woman," he said, addressing the wife, "you accuse him with your tongue, but his eyes, they do not match your tale." The crowd murmured in agreement. People leaned forward, studying his face more carefully than ever. They saw how steady he remained, how he did not lash out or defend himself. Yet behind that steadiness was a storm, a hidden pain that could not be denied. She tried to ignore it, raising her voice again. "Do not be fooled. He hides behind silence. He knows if he speaks, the truth will condemn him." But her words only rang hollow. Because his silence was not emptiness, and his eyes, were too full of truth to be ignored. A young boy, standing with his father at the edge of the crowd, whispered, "Why does he look so sad?" The father placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because sometimes the deepest pain has no words." And in that moment the crowd understood. His silence was not guilt, it was grief. His stillness was not defiance, it was endurance. And his eyes, though quiet, told a story of wounds deeper than any tongue could ever describe. As the gathering ended, the wife's words hung forgotten, lost in the night air. But the image of his eyes remained with the villagers. They carried it home in their hearts, whispering about it to their families. And slowly, without him saying a single word, they began to believe his truth. Because though his lips stayed closed, his eyes had spoken, and no one could unhear what they saw. In the tense stillness of the village gathering, her voice echoed sharply, accusing, twisting, and shaping lies into what she hoped would sound like truth. Yet he stood unmoved, his lips sealed, his eyes steady. Each time she raised her voice to insist on her innocence, his silence deepened the doubt in those listening. It was as though every unspoken word he held within him carried more weight than the loudest scream. Her confidence began to falter, cracks showing in her story, her own contradictions exposing her. The more she tried to explain, the more the silence surrounding him demanded proof she did not have. Finally, under the heavy pressure of unspoken truth, her mask slipped. Her trembling hands, shifting eyes, and stumbling tongue betrayed her far louder than his voice ever could. In the end, his silence forced her lies into the open, and the truth stood clear before everyone. The air was thick with unease as she spun her tale, weaving excuses and half-truths in a desperate attempt to hold control. But he remained still, his silence heavier than any accusation. The villagers watched him closely, his calm face, his unwavering eyes, the quiet strength in his posture. Without lifting a finger, without uttering a single defense, he drew them away from her words. Each lie she spoke rang hollow, echoing into the emptiness of his silence until it collapsed under its own weight. Slowly, the people began to see the cracks, to sense the truth behind the quiet man's steady gaze. Judgment shifted, not because of anything he said but because of what he did not need to say. In that silence, the crowd turned, their trust slipping from her trembling voice to the man who spoke volumes without ever opening his mouth. The night had grown heavy with all that had been said, yet the weight of what remained unspoken lingered strongest. She had exhausted every defense, every desperate plea, every trembling denial. But he sat there, unmoving, his silence pressing against her like a mirror she could no longer avoid. The villagers, once swayed by her words, now leaned into the quiet, hearing in it a truth far louder than her cries. His silence was not surrender, it was resistance, patience, and a final judgment. It carried the pain of betrayal, the strength of endurance, and the cry of a soul wronged. By refusing to speak, he forced the truth to rise on its own. And when her mask finally broke, when her voice cracked beneath the burden of her lies, the silence became justice itself. In the end, it wasn't her words that shaped the story, it was his last silence, the cry no voice could ever match.